So let's continue on, David, in our conversation about this operation and the implications that come for Venezuela after. Of course, David is a former senior CIA operations officer with deep experience in Latin America, as well as working with U.S. Central Command with Delta Force, which was the team that went in and seized Maduro and his wife. Do you expect that with the Cubans taking care of Maduro's protection, obviously unsuccessfully, but do you expect that the Russians, the Chinese, the Cubans, the Iranians will be conducting operations either directly or indirectly through proxies inside Venezuela right now?
Well, you know, as far as operations aimed at um, propping up the government or trying to figure out who the leak was, what specifically are you think that they might be doing?
Trying to reverse what the United States is trying to achieve, trying to slow it down, obstruct it. So that could take many different forms.
Yeah, no doubt. But I think uh, my assessment, I mean, weeks ago was that if push came to shove and you had a military type operation, which we did, or you had a follow-on operation, right? Even boots on the ground, I think Maduro understood that he was not going to get a 911 call response from China, Iran, Cuba, or Russia. It just was not going to happen. I mean, Russia is so engaged right now in the Ukraine and taking such a beating there. I mean, there's very little, if anything, they could do resource wise to help out Venezuela, nor would they want to, given the kind of the fragile state of the negotiations in the Ukraine. And China it's all about business. I mean, they understand that, and China would be concerned that if a new government comes in, are they going to cancel all the contracts that they have with them and lose billions of dollars? Cuba, militarily, they have nothing to offer. I mean, they're nothing more than kind of a social project military right now. They may have a couple units that are combat effective, but I mean, it's nothing more than just guys going out and doing social projects. Um, and then there's Iran, who not much they have to offer. So I think Maduro even understood the fact that if it came to a kinetic type operation, any 911 calls to his best friends, right, were not going to be answered with any support. I think that's why. I think, now you could have Russian and Chinese and all these out there trying to say, okay, we need to provide information about Maduro on U.S. policy or U.S. moves towards Venezuela to give Delcy a heads up as to what may be happening, provide her advantage in these type of negotiations. And I think that would be standard practice for our adversaries as far as helping out a
Mhm.
nation in order to make our life, United States life, more difficult.
And it's curious to note that the ambassadors from some of the countries we're discussing right now were among the first to congratulate Delcy on her new position. Do you see Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping interpreting the United States as being distracted with Venezuela now and potentially being more emboldened, maybe not just in Venezuela, but in other places? Or will they be more hesitant because we're seeing that this president, Trump, will not shy away from using military force and taking decisive action?
Well, yes to all the above. I think the reaction has been very multifaceted. Not only publicly but also privately. I mean, you look at China and says, okay, well, um, we have literally loaned Venezuela hundreds of billions of dollars, and we have a lot of investment there. Or, you know, how do we handle this? Do we push back on the U.S.? Do we make it difficult for them? And then what happens if we get a new democratic government in there and they solve things we were doing and decide, well, we're canceling the contract? On the Russian side, I mean, the Russian involvement was limited mainly to a few oil deals that they made, but mostly it was selling Venezuelan weapons, which again failed against Western weapons. Again, the Venezuelan Air Force has some, you know, I think first production F-16s, which are kind of hangar queens, and now they bought these. I think they bought the Su-30s about 15, 16 years ago, which are also hangar queens. So their radar systems were mostly Chinese and Russian. Their anti-aircraft system was almost all Russian. Didn't work too well. So they have to be looking at this as a kind of a real win for the U.S., not only regionally but worldwide, as Trump taking that. I mean, the one thing about I will say about this administration that I saw during my career, this includes the first presidency, there's a lot of value in not knowing how a president's going to react. Um, we've seen with past administrations where, and I'm very apolitical, but see with past administrations where it was very obvious to our adversaries that uh, it would take a long time to reach a decision on our part if a decision could be reached. Whereas with this administration, there's really not much time between the action and the reaction. So that, in a certain way, is a form of, how would I say, pushing back on our adversaries, and it's a form of actually stopping some of the malintent that we see from our adversaries because they just don't know what their reaction will be.
Right. Right. It was also interesting that Trump was very vocal about how the United States took out Venezuela's systems as the operation was underway, acknowledging that, showing the U.S. capabilities. That has to be something that Xi Jinping is noting as he moves closer toward a potential invasion of Taiwan, as he described reunification just on New Year's Eve in his speech. And any thoughts on that? The fact that
No, it's a
Trump
great
was
point, Sasha. I would argue that not only that your great point that he saw how these systems worked or failed to work, but he also looked at Trump's decision-making process, which was, okay, I'll I'll take those gambles. I'm willing to use U.S. military. And then how would that apply to any Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
Mhm.
So again, that's something no doubt that they're calculating and wargaming right now in these countries. But I want to get back to a point that one of the weaknesses of these governments, both in China, we saw in Russia during the Ukraine war, probably no doubt in Venezuela, and definitely in Cuba, is that, and also thrown Iran, is that the problem with, and this gets back to the intelligence. Um, the problem is with a lot of these authoritarian governments and heads of state like President Xi, uh, President Putin, uh, is that it's very difficult to bring bad news to the president, to that head of state. You saw it in the Ukraine when, in the Ukraine, FSB was and is in charge of conducting intelligence operations in the Ukraine. So it was not the Foreign Intelligence Service SVR, it was the FSB. And having really looked at some of the open source assessment on this, it was a classic case of the FSB providing intelligence to President Putin of everything he wanted to hear prior to the invasion. That the Ukrainians are going to welcome him with open arms.
it'll take like a
Ukraine,
couple days to take Kyiv, right?
right? The Ukrainian military won't be able to stand up against us. The U.S. will not react. They're already trying to get Zelensky out of Ukraine. I mean, it was it was biased intelligence, but more importantly, it was a system which did not allow for information which goes against what that leader wanted to do. And kudos to our own intelligence community where that's built into the system, where especially CIA, we're known for being the bad news bearers sometimes. I've been in that position myself when I've told um, our own president information he may not want to hear, but that is a responsibility of the CIA and the whole intelligence community. I don't think that's happening in Venezuela. Definitely not happening in Russia. Definitely not happening in China. And that's interesting in the fact, but that could be a problem for both us and for the other countries, because if you're not hearing what you need to hear, you're going to make decisions based on bad information, which could have major worldwide implications. I think we may see some of that in Venezuela, and now with the Cubans, probably no doubt briefing Delcy on all kinds of information that they claim they're collecting in the United States as far as policy and our next moves. I mean, in Venezuela, Chavez and Maduro, to a certain extent, they used to have invasion drills all the time and claiming, that they had information that U.S. was going to invade. This went on for decades. Never happened. So
Mm,
again, it's one of the
yeah.
pitfalls of intelligence services who are unable or unwilling to provide true and factual information to their leaders.
And I think that explaining how that self-censorship that has to happen creates a deterioration from within. But there are Americans who fear that that is what is happening in the US intelligence community. And we can even talk about it in the case of Venezuela when the National Intelligence Council says that Venezuela is not directing Tren de Aragua in the United States. This administration says that Maduro and Venezuela are responsible for this. People then get fired from the National Intelligence Council. And there have been, I think there was also the Defense Intelligence Agency director who um, essentially contradicted some of the president's claims about obliterating Iran's nuclear facilities. There was a preliminary assessment that leaked that suggested that there was damage, but it was not complete. So I do want to push back on the fact that there is some hesitation that I have been hearing about in terms of, do you lose your job for saying something that isn't convenient to this president? Not to take away from the effectiveness of what has happened here and the fact that there are a lot of Venezuelans who are quietly celebrating the fact that Maduro is gone and hoping that the opposition can remain. Rubio said, quote, to NBC News, you can't turn Venezuela into the operating hub for Iran, for Russia, for Hezbollah, for China, for the Cuban intelligence agents that control the country. That cannot continue. That is what this administration wants to see happen. Is that possible right now when you have Delcy Rodriguez at its helm?
Well, again, that's part of the transition. My argument would be that that's part of the transition. So, you know, if the Russians aren't going to leave tomorrow, Cubans aren't going to leave tomorrow, the Chinese aren't going to leave tomorrow. It's not going to happen. But I think if the transition goes as the administration hopes, I think what you're going to see is, and there's a certain logic to why they want to do transition vice installing a new government. I mean, uh, Iraq's the classic example, but I was involved in the transition in Panama and in Haiti, right? We invaded Haiti and also Panama. There was a change of government or a regime change, but I think one of the important factors that we saw there, it wasn't a wholesale, I'll use the term de-Ba'athization of the security services like we saw in Iraq. I mean, we used interim police forces, which in Panama now have really professionalized. The Panama National Police are one of the most professional law enforcement services in Latin America. In Haiti, they started out on a good foot, not working too well now, but the actual initial result was very positive. I'm not sure you could do that right now in Venezuela without putting boots on the ground like we had in Haiti and Panama. So I think that was something they wanted to avoid was trying to do that wholesale change and rather do it in a transitional manner.
Yeah.
And therefore we have Delcy now who we'll see how the pressure campaign works as far as the administration getting changes made that they view as necessary.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see if this approach is effective. It'll be fascinating to see that. What the president said was, quote, what happened to Maduro can happen to them. But of course, Delcy, Padrino, Cabello, they are all going to be much more careful in who they trust now. And so, what kinds of resources is this going to take from the CIA? Can you give me a sense of whether or not it's going to pull resources from other areas? Because really, let's think about where the agency has been over the years in past. We're talking about great power competition with Russia and China and counterterrorism, not the Western Hemisphere. This administration likes to talk about the Monroe Doctrine, but we're talking about a new priority. Does that pull resources from other areas?
Well, it should, and I assume it is, because again, this is one of the president's priorities, and that's how the intelligence responds to the president's priorities. And if they need to shift resources, they shift resources, or they go through Congress and obtain more resources, which are mainly funding. But the actual resources at hand, they can. The intelligence community is used to that. We shift resources across the board all the time. So in Latin America, again, being a Latin America officer most of my career, again, I would argue that we kind of ignored the hemisphere for too long and we took a lot of things for granted, right? And we were too focused on the CT fight. Um, and then prior to that, we had the issues in the first Iraq War, a lot of focus on Iran, North
Hmm.
Korea, which is great, right? But my experience is that the administration, and I'm talking about all of the former presidents, not just any specific one, never really focused on Latin America till there was a crisis, right? And then it was kind of the fireman reaction. Okay, put out the fire, right? And then once that was put out, it was um, okay. We'll go into our current priorities. There's one example in Latin America. I won't name the country, but where there was a coup attempt, and I won't name the administration, but um, we got a call from the NSC saying, "Oh my God, this is an intelligence failure. How come you didn't tell us about this? And what are you going to do about it?" And our response was, "Well, yes, we did. There was here's the serial numbers for the intelligence reports we put out, and here's the serial numbers for the finished products we put out." Letting you know that this was a more than a possibility. It was a probability there could be a coup in next country. And it was the point where they just didn't read it. So I
Wow.
think, a lot of that is not on the intelligence community. A lot of it is on the policy community. And that goes across the board. There's no Democrat guilty or Republican president guilty. That has been across the board vis-a-vis Latin America. So in many ways, Trump is probably one of the first modern presidents to really focus on Latin America. And time will tell whether that focus was the right decision or not.
And it's interesting because in Trump's first term, he was really the first to draw attention to the threat of China. That was where we started to see policies that were trying to call out the intellectual espionage theft. There were many different aspects of how he was trying to uh, affect change and had diplomatic effects on the interactions as well. But so, yeah, I think that in a way, what we're talking about here is the emphasis on Venezuela and the Western Hemisphere is him opening up another door. My question to you is this a door that needs to be opened more? Do you think that him focusing so much on this area is the right thing to do when we still see Russia pummeling Ukraine, when we see China increasingly emboldened with more opportunities for diplomatic engagement as the US has pulled back globally? Is this the right move in your view?
Well, I'll give an example. At one point, after the government moved from the CT fight to I think our special forces community is a great example where SOCOM budgets have been the special operations command budgets have been reduced. Special forces have been reduced as the shift and I saw this when I was in Central Command, there had been a shift to more of the conventional military. And that was based on the fact that CT was a priority, but was not the priority because it was determined that our greatest threat to security was China and Russia.
Mhm.
And so if we go to war with Russia or China, special forces are always going to be important, but it's going to be the conventional forces which are going to be the main focus. And so I remember having some conversations with some of my military counterparts, and they said, "Well, are you guys doing the same shift? Going from CT to," and I had to remind them. I said, "We never shifted away from the hard targets. We never shifted away from Russia. We never shifted away from China. The priorities may have shifted, or the some of the resources may have shifted, but the intelligence community and specifically the CIA, we never shifted. We never quit working against Russia. We never quit working against China, Iran, North Korea. So it's not a monumental. It's fact that we're putting resources in Latin America. It's not going to affect our priorities against China and Russia because those have always been there. Even in the height of the war against CT, we never let our gloves down. We always continued to focus on Russia and China, and that is a perpetual priority for the intelligence community, especially CIA.
Thank you for explaining that. So we have about 10 minutes left here. Uh, Do you believe that Delcy Rodriguez will be able to hold on to power when you have other members of that inner circle? You also have different elements to include the Venezuelan security forces, the Colombian militant groups. You have a lot of different gangs on various levels with different capabilities. You have the Venezuelan people. You have Maria Corina Machado, who vows to come back to Venezuela, opposition leader who won that Nobel Peace Prize, who is calling for elections right now. Does Delcy Rodriguez have a future? And what do you see lying ahead?
Well, I think the goal would not to have Delcy as the president, no doubt, but via peaceful transition by, say, a military takeover. So I think her biggest problem is she's not going to have the influence and the control over some of her rivals. Namely, I would highlight Diosdado Cabello, who is the Minister of Interior. Um, he always had kind of, I'm not sure I'd use the word contentious, but I would say let's just say maybe a professional relationship with Maduro. Uh, he was much closer to Chavez than he was to Maduro. Maduro always viewed him as a political rival, and Diosdado always had great amount of influence because he was the one who controlled or had the greatest influence within the military and the security circles. And so he kind of controlled that lever. But I think they reached an agreement where they understood they were dependent on each other for survival, for regime survival. I mean, Diosdado he's all in on this. I mean, he's indicted also, as is Defense Minister Valdemir Patrino. So that's going to be, I think, one of Delcy's, how would I say, problem sets is how does she able to run the government without letting these guys kind of become behind the scenes puppet masters and start doing things that could somehow rock the boat for her and her hopeful transition to free elections. So we'll see how that plays out. But for me, the key guy to watch is Diosdado Cabello and see where he goes with this.
Yeah, yeah, that seems to be the general thought, and his name comes up most when it comes to who could be also most concerning because his way of leading the country, I've read, could be more brutal than what we saw in Maduro. And I'd be curious for you to talk about that. But let's also think for a second about Machado, the opposition leader. I was surprised when Trump spoke on Sunday that he said that she's a nice woman, but she doesn't have the support of the people. It's been reported that he snubbed her because he wanted the Nobel Peace Prize. She got it. She called him right after. She offers it to him. She's trying to play nice, but he doesn't want to. That's what's been reported. Um, Opposition leaders are not in Venezuela right now. I recently interviewed Brian Stern from Grable Rescue, who extracted Machado from Venezuela to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo. But you had previously described how opposition in Venezuela, or for Venezuela, since they're not in Venezuela, that it's fragmented. Can you share more on that as we think about whether or not elections can happen and who could come next when it comes to people who disagree with what the Maduro regime has done to Venezuela?
No, great point, Sasha. And yeah, it's definitely worth a commentary. First of all, I think Maria Machado is a extremely brave human being, and um, she's probably a unicorn when it comes to the opposition. Again, what I've always briefed policymakers, what I've always briefed um, other countries about Venezuela was that both during the Chavez regime and during the Maduro regime, one of their greatest advantages to staying in power was the actual opposition because they were so fragmented. You had circles within the opposition. All the leaders kind of wanted to be the next president, so they were competing against each other. They were undermining each other. If Chavez and Maduro couldn't buy him off, they would intimidate him or send him into exile. None of them really stood up and were willing to take a unified stance and say and sacrifice their ego and their, I would say, opportunity to be president one day for the better of the country. I
Hmm.
mean, are none. And that's why I respect Maria Machado so much because she said, okay, I'm Edmando Gonzalez, I want you to be the candidate if I can't be it. And she's a really brave one. I don't think she's out of the picture because think about it. Although they haven't stated it with detail, but I would speculate that the administration's goal is to transition to an ability or willingness to have true free elections. And Maria Machado would be the hands-on favorite to win those elections.
I mean, we've seen.
And I think,
Oh, sorry. I didn't want to cut you off. Hmm.
no, I think she would get all the support of the administration at that time. But I kind of understand the logic of the administration in the sense that they believe, and I do too, knowing Venezuela like I know Venezuela. Right now, if you said we're going to hold the elections next month, they're not ready for it. The institutions are corrupted. They're all being run by Chavistas. There's a lot of institution building that needs to be done and a political stability established along with a security mechanism before that can be held. If she showed up right now and rallied the troops and had big demonstration, okay, what's next? What would you do?
Right,
So
but who's going to be strengthening those institutions, setting up the infrastructure for the free and fair elections when we have seen this institutional rot? We don't have boots on the ground. We don't have anybody who's willing to do that work for us.
there lies the $100,000 question. I mean, and this is why I think all of us are waiting for the details of how this transition is supposed to play out. Okay, I think it's premature right now to say how this is going to work out. There's so many things you need to do. Um, and I was earlier today. I was interviewed by CNBC, and one of the issues I brought up is that the infrastructure is so decrepit. The institutions are so criminalized. Okay, it is going to take billions of dollars in time in order to bring Venezuela back to just a figure of the modern world. Having been traveled to Venezuela, over decades, I mean, you go back down there now, it's a time warp to what it used to be. And you have the poverty rate that is the lowest, almost the lowest in the hemisphere, right? And it's one of the richest countries in the world in resources. So, in order for this transition to work, in order to rebuild Venezuela, you're going to have to get these things established first, and that is get PDVSA back up towards actually making money and not being corrupted by the cronies, right? Build infrastructure and invite Western investment into the country in order to rebuild not only the country but the institutions. And it's going to take time. So that's the question. I'm really waiting to see how this is going to play out.
Yeah, I think that's what we're all doing here. And, where we are a month from now, 2 months from now, could be very different than where we are today. David, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me this morning. It's been a very interesting conversation, and I expect you will be in high demand in the days ahead.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
You're going to
You
be
know,
exhausted. You're going to be exhausted. I know that you used to be a police officer. I'm so curious to know how you landed at the CIA. So maybe we'll talk offline about that. But appreciate you coming on Human.
okay, Sasha. It was a pleasure for me, and look forward to coming back one day.
Me too. Okay. All the best to you and to everybody who is watching our conversation. Thank you. Have a good one.
Take care. Have a great day.